Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see all of you who made it. You'll notice that the lights are up, and we plan to keep them up a little so we can see faces and eyes and know that you haven't left us. You'll also notice, of course, that I have with me Jennifer Keesmaat. You may have noticed in morning papers, the casino is now dead. The mayor seems to be engaging in extracurricular activities. And Jennifer here to explain the doings at City Hall to us all. Not true.
Well, thank you, David. It's fabulous to be here with you today. You've had such an important impact on this city, and we feel David's legacy every day. I'm not here to explain City Hall to you. That would take too much time, and that's not the focus of what we're doing today. But we are today going to be focusing on best practices from Toronto, but also from around the world. And I'm really thrilled to be here to learn from many of our panelists who've come from away, who are bringing their expertise, their ideas that can begin to shape how we think about Toronto.
It is interesting, and I'm sure you've noticed it with the panelists and perhaps in other conferences you've been at, that there are always significant differences between cities, even on the same continent or the same country or the same province. But there is always a thread of general practice that you can learn from. And it is interesting to me because the differences are important, but the similarities are where we should start. And then later on, once we understand there's a kind of general practice, a general thread, some general concepts occurring, then you look for the differences, because the differences are where the arguments are. The differences are where the conflicts are. And I've noticed that, even though they were polite, because there are a lot of them Canadian, they're very polite. There are tensions, and you should pay attention to the tensions because they're where the gold is.
Well, that's an important point, because we tend to sometimes focus on our differences. We do this in planning in the City of Toronto. But this is all about beginning from the point of shared interests and recognizing those shared interests as that starting point. And that's really what I think today is about, is that idea of shared interests as being an important starting point for moving forward.
It really is. One of the things that people talk to me about, they always ask me about City Hall. I always try and change the topic. But they ask me about City Hall, and I say, City Hall does more good work. And I mean this. This is not a commercial. It does more good work, both at the bureaucratic level and at the political level, than you know, because you mainly hear about the bad news. They used to be saying years ago, if it's good, if it's bad, it's news, and if it's good, it's advertising. And somehow we've got to get beyond simply the day-to-day reporting of the conflicts and see the value. I do a lot of walking in this city. Still do. I started off, I was Jennifer's height, and I walk forever. And so I visit the old neighborhoods. I visit some of the new ones. I get on the streetcar or the subway and go out to Scarborough, Etobicoke, or out to Mimico. I was talking to people this morning. And it always strikes me that the city is moving really well. It is. People say, what was it like in the good old days? It's better. It is better. The waterfront is better. Neighborhoods that were in hard shape before, if you want to go out and see what the Junction looks like now, for example, or go out to any part of the city, and you'll see that generally speaking, there's a lot of good news out there. Now, I'm not a good news bearer here, but I am trying to explain to you, best and out of my heart, that people should take pride in this city. One of the things I discovered about Torontonians years ago is we respond better to pride than we do to shame. So we need to dwell on the good news because that motivates us to make it better. At any rate.
Hey, you're speaking my language.
No, I'm sorry. Okay,
you're speaking my language.
But you're the planner.
That's my whole shtick. Is that there's great things about this city that we want to build on. So we are going to kick off with our panel.
We are. This is on sustainability. Sustainability, some of you will remember, It's been around for a long time, but it's about 30 years old that it actually got its start, and that was through Grow Brundtland's report, our shared, no, not our shared world. What was it called?
Our common future.
Our common future. Close. Our common future, and she actually gave credibility around the world to the word sustainability. It gained out of the Rio Summit in 1992. It gained greater coinage, but over the years, it's become for at least a lay public. It's just kind of a buzzword. They're not sure exactly what it's supposed to mean. It began to lose a sense of crispness to the term. What do we mean by it? What is a sustainable city? How do you build them? What is it we're supposed to do to change our consumption habits, or consuming habits rather, in order to have a sustainable city? We know that cities are where we can solve the issues of climate change. They are all the issues that allow us to be sustainable as a human race. They are going to be solved in the 21st century, if they're solved at all, in the cities. And so we have a first-class panel to look at what we should do, what sustainability means, and how we go about it. And let me introduce them. I'm going to ask, you want me to do that?
You know what? I'll sit down.
We're just doing this.
I'm moderating this panel, so I'm going to sit down.
Right.
And you can keep talking through the introductions.
Thank you. I like a decider. Thank you very much. Joining Jennifer will be Carl Johan Kortsis, who's the city manager of the city of Jönköping.
Hi.
Hi. Cheery guy.
Welcome.
Next is Ron Van Holst, who's the Director of High Performance Computing, is an expert on cities, Innovation Forum, and the Ontario City Centre. I was talking to you earlier. Man was born in Guelph.
Hi, Ron.
Good morning.
Welcome.
Richard McIntosh is the lead of the Integrated Infrastructure Halsell. And there's your panel,
Richard.
ladies and gentlemen. And Jennifer, it's all yours.
Okay, so let's jump right into this. The topic is sustainability. We're going to be talking about water and energy systems. Here we are sitting in the middle of the Great Lakes system. We have lots of fresh water. Really, what's the big deal if a little bit of that water goes to waste? Aren't we rich in water as a resource? What's the real key issue here from a sustainability perspective? Any one of you can kind of kick this off.
I'll start it. I think that we've had definitely the privilege, the benefit, and also the curse of living beside some of Canada, or some of the world's freshest water supply. And as a result of that, we've consumed it at an alarming rate. If you compare the way that we consume versus other major cities, Germany, Austria, Denmark, we're roughly 320 liters per person per day in Canada, and that fluctuates from province to province. But that's kind of the rough number. And if you consider what the Germans, the Danes, and the Austrians consume, it's roughly a half to a third of what we consume to do the exact same function. Eventually, we're going to start seeing greater stresses and strains on the way that we use water, and less on a local impact, but I think more on a macro impact, on a global impact. That the social and global stresses that we're going to face, that there's depleting sources everywhere. You're seeing a lot more water scarcity in the United States, which is our neighbor. Obviously, people know that. And I think just by that proximity alone, I think that we're going to be seeing greater strain on the way that we use our water.
Do the others want to weigh in? Is this really a significant issue? It appears like there's a lot of water on the planet.
I think for us, I would echo the comments earlier that because we have such a wealth of this water, we've taken that for granted, and it hasn't allowed us or hasn't forced us to be very inventive and creative in the management of it and the use of it. And I think that's unfortunate, and I think we do need to, before we hit a crisis, there was many discussions yesterday about sometimes we have to get into a crisis before we radically change what we do. But hopefully if we get the right people together, we can not get into crisis mode and be able to manage one of the world's most precious assets, fresh water, and we have more of it in a very small space than I think anywhere else on the planet. And I think it's an opportunity for us, and that's why we're here together today, is to show leadership in terms of stewardship of such a precious resource.
So we have in the Great Lakes region, and I only know this because I have a 13-year-old daughter who just wrote a talk on the water levels in Georgian Bay and the way the water levels seem to be decreasing significantly. What's the real issue here? Is it human impact? Is it because of the what's it called, the tectonic shift that's happening, that's actually draining water and moving it to different parts? What is the real issue here that we're dealing with when we're talking about our water supply?
I would say it's a human impact actually, because we have the same situation in Sweden as you have in Canada, that we have almost too much of fresh water. But at the same time, we know already that it's a lack of fresh water in the world. And I think that will be one very big issue for in the future. Maybe not will be wars about oil in 100 years from now. It will be wars about fresh water actually. So that's why when you are planning the new cities, because people want to move to the lakes, to the sea, so the pressure will increase for each year actually.
So this means water management is a really important, increasingly this is going to be a very important issue. Let's actually focus on that idea for a moment. If the impacts on our water supply are something that we've created ourselves, surely we can manage that. There's ways that we can have a positive impact on our water supply. Maybe we should start with some examples from Sweden. Your city is a leader in sustainable development. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you've done really at the very local level around water management?
Well, I mean, the local level, I wouldn't just say water management. It's how you build the new city around the water, actually. Because water management, we have tradition since many, 200 years soon, actually, with water plants and how to clean the water. But the big issue now, actually, when you are building the cities, because the cities itself affects the fresh water. And that's why what we are now trying to, when we are planning the new city center in Jönköping, we will, excuse me, Jönköping, I know it's a very hard word in English, but that's the name of our city anyway. And now we will plan in the deep city center, we actually are planning a new area that will be 30,000 new citizens just in 20 years from now. And all will be living by the lake. Of course, it's a huge challenge actually to make these people, to combine people with their environment and to stay by the lake, and not to increase the pressure on the freshwater quality actually.
So, Carl-Jan, I'd like to know a little bit more specifically the things that you're doing, I guess at a regional level as well as at a municipal level, to respond to that challenge. And I'm going to pick on you in a minute, Richard, as well on that same topic. Very specifically, what can be done to plan our cities and build our cities in such a way that we're having a very different impact?
The very most important thing, and I think I know that doesn't sound so hard maybe, but it's city planning, to actually have long-term city planning, and then be actually to keep to that map. When you have drawn that map for how to build a new city, because always you have this conflict with the short-term side from the developers to make the quick fix sometimes. And actually that's the hardest challenge actually, to have this city planning, and it will take your time, and it must be in a very strategic level, and then actually keep to that plan, whatever will happen actually. That's the key. So it's not rocket science, but I know almost every day you get conflicts between the demands for the short-term problems, and how you build a city for the next, you build a city for 100, 200, 300 years. Yeah. I mean, we're used in that in Sweden. Our oldest city center in Stockholm, called Gamla Stan, I mean, they built it in 1200 to 1300 years ago. So, I mean, and that's one thing actually that worries me a little bit when you see some projects here in Toronto, for instance. I don't see really the long-term planning there.
Well, I'm glad you raised that.
But now I stopped here, otherwise I go into Canadian domestic politics.
And then the panel went sideways. We could go really sideways on that, but we won't go sideways on it. But I'm glad you raised that, because I held a roundtable several months ago on resiliency and how we build the city to be resilient in the very long term. And interestingly, there was a city councillor who was in the room who he might even be here today, Councillor Parker. I'm not sure if you're here today, but I know he registered to be here. And Councillor Parker actually raised his hand and said, one of the challenges that we have at the city is that I'm hearing what the panelists are saying, and there's a tremendous urgency to shift the way we plan and to plan for the long term. But, as the headlines today might dictate, we're constantly immersed in the very immediate. We're constantly immersed and we're almost consumed with the very immediate. And that ends up being a real constraint to being able to lift our eyes and take that long view. And even our planning horizons at a provincial level right now, we're planning for 2031. Just 2031. It's around the corner, really.
Yeah.
We need a much longer planning horizon than the planning horizons that we have. Richard, do you want to weigh in on this? Some specific things that cities can do to manage their sustainability?
Good question. I think that the forecasting is a big one. I think that we're now looking at what's the impact of increasing storm frequencies and also the amount of water that hits a city. And if we continue to build impervious surfaces, the rate of flooding is going to go up. So I know other cities that have actually mandated that you have a discharge tank in every building to prevent that. And I think that if you're in that floodplain, and I think that the floodplain of 10 years ago might not be the floodplain of tomorrow. And like my basement flooded, we had a big storm the other day, and we've never had a flood. We're actually on a bit of a hill. So it's even like, I don't know how water defies the laws of gravity, but if there's enough of it, it will find its way in. And I don't think that our structures to date have been designed to accommodate for the amount of winds, the prevailing direction that then drives different penetrations of water into buildings. So I think that the days of, I don't want to switch the topic too much, but I think the days of all glass towers are going to see a big burden in the future when they have to not only mitigate for air infiltration, but also for stormwater or rainwater penetration.
Well, so this links in very nicely to the topic of the kind of infrastructure that we build and the way we build our infrastructure, because in many ways, our infrastructure, when much of our infrastructure was built, not hundreds and hundreds of years ago here, but at least 100 years ago, we didn't in fact plan for adaptability in a significant way. You could argue we're still doing the same thing today. We also, climate change, radical weather patterns was on no one's radar screen. We weren't even thinking about it. But so here we are today. All of this is front and center in our thinking. How should we be planning our infrastructure differently? What should we be doing? Now we don't have the excuse. Now we can't say, oh, well, we didn't see this coming. We didn't know this was going to be a global issue 100 years later. Now we know. The writing's on the wall. What are the implications? And Ron, you might want to weigh in here a little bit and talk about some of the research and analysis that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. You began with the question in terms of lake levels. Is it a man-made impact? And it's easy to say, yes, it is. But in what way? How are we impacting it? And what are the implications of climate and extreme weather? And you brought in the factor of extreme weather in the cities. And I thank you. I'd like to highlight some of the research projects. We at Ontario Centres of Excellence bring together academic and industrial research partners to bring in the big challenges. And one of the big challenges that we are helping to fund and helping to coordinate is the instrumentation of the Grand River watershed. The Grand River watershed feeds, if I'm trying to make sure I get it right, I think it feeds into Lake Ontario, if I'm right. I'm going back to my high school geography, which is over 30 years ago. So, but it's the Grand River watershed, 1 million people get their drinking water from it. And it feeds also the most sort of productive agricultural zone in all of Canada. And we are instrumenting that with all kinds of technology to understand exactly what's happening in that watershed above and below ground. And there's also a startup company from University of Waterloo that has a 3D hydrological model to model not just the surface flows, but the subsurface flows. So we understand the impacts of rain on the rivers, but also on the aquifers. And our research project is also coupling that with climate research from University of Toronto with Professor Dick Peltier, so that we are looking at a model using Canada's fastest supercomputer to model the impact of climate on a regional scale. Most climate models run on a continental or even a global scale, but we're scaling down the climate models to a regional scale, to Ontario scale, to Grand River watershed scale, and then couple it with hydrological models and say, what's going to happen to the water table? What's going to happen to the watershed 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now? How is that impacting the Great Lakes? I mean, I think the project was originally trying to model all of the Great Lakes, but we decided, or they decided, that maybe we cut off something a little bit smaller like this, watershed, and then build up from there. We could model all of the Great Lakes. It's just a limit of computing capacity. So human impact, yes. Exactly how? Understanding exactly what's impacting that and be able to accurately measure that. When we can accurately measure, then we can manage. Then we can make intelligent policies and intelligent decisions about how we change our impact to the watershed, to the lakes, to both our natural water systems and our man-made water systems, because we have research projects to instrument and manage and analyze that as well.
So I was going to, as you were explaining the whole system, I was, in my head I was thinking, so creating a tremendous amount of data and analysis, supercomputer you mentioned, so there's a lot of complexity in terms of how this is being done. How does that connect in to behavior change, or to, how does that really have a tangible impact? Because I think one of the risks I see is that we don't seem to connect very well generating data and analysis to our policy outcomes. And I'm wondering, I think all of you can probably speak to that, and I'm curious to hear how you've done that in Sweden using that data-based approach and analysis, and how that actually affects behavior and how it affects choices people make.
Yeah, I mean, and an interesting thing actually is that when we are planning our new neighborhoods everywhere in Sweden, actually, we are planning for the next 100 years of increasing climate change. So it almost get the feeling that we have already giving up.
Yeah.
And that's a huge problem actually. But I say that I think it's we say in Swedish, it's hard to let all dogs to sit down, and I think the way of going this way through actually is going with our children, and I feel it very, 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 very hard actually when I talk to my own children and their friends about how their awareness about climate change is about the same as I had in the 70s when I was a child about the nuclear world war. There's anxiety about that. So actually, I think it's no quick fix here. It's actually to try to show people, and especially our young people, actually the consequences of our way of living. Actually, and you can see some small signs of this actually. That youngsters in Sweden, they don't take any driver license any longer. They stop buying cars. That's a very, I don't know how it's in Canada, but actually a very strong trend.
It's
I think
similar in
it has decreased now in Sweden the last 10 years with 25%. So actually it's really getting worrying the European automotive industry actually, because they see the next generation is not will buy any cars. And what they want to do instead, actually, they want to live in very dense areas. And that's actually one good thing I must say about Toronto, that you're really densing the town. That actually you can live in a very tight, tight place, and actually don't need to take your car. You can walk to a job or where you're going to shop and so on. So I think it's a very long-sighted way of changing the way of living, actually.
Well, and I'm glad you started that whole conversation with neighborhood planning and taking that long-term view, and then ended it talking about the very dense neighborhoods, because the little Toronto plug here is that of the 67,000 units that we have approved in the city of Toronto, 45% of them are right in the downtown core, and people moving into the downtown core are choosing to walk to work. We have a very high percentage of people living in the core who walk to work and who don't own a car. And whereas it might seem like we're not doing enough, that very large land use planning pattern has a significant impact on our carbon footprint.
I would say that to dense the city centers has got more effect actually compared to change fuel with your car and so on. Actually, that dense your footprint of the climate change. Actually, I would say that.
Sorry, that it's the most significant?
I would say that.
Yeah. Do others agree? So that it's interesting to see you nodding your heads and saying that, because I think that's a very big shift that I've seen happen in planning and in our thinking about sustainability really over the past 5 to 10 years. Because 5 or 10 years ago when we talked about sustainability, we talked about solar panels. We actually talked about technologies and gadgets as opposed to larger land use planning. Do you want to kind of weigh in on that, Richard?
Yeah, I would, and just to add to that too, I think that in the last 50 years, I think that we still planned in silos. I think we had stormwater were stormwater issues, we had parks which were park issues, potable water, energy, they were all kind of isolated and in their own separate islands where, I don't know you can actually see the audience today, which is nice, but who here yesterday was part of that visualization presentation that Jay gave. So PB, Parson Brinkerhoff, we're the Canadian operating arm for Parson Brinkerhoff. And I think that what we're seeing now is an ability to actually forecast. So the presentation, if you weren't here yesterday, is he literally rebuilt a city at every layer. So the infrastructure layer that supports the city, the built form, the congestion, the traffic, the people, how people move, and the things that you can do with that once the data set is available. And this was a 12-year plan. Sorry, this is a 12-year project. So over the span of these 12 years, this was better informed and more buildings came online and more road networks and more congestion, more traffic studies. And so it wasn't like they just built the model in 6 months. But I think through that, though, you can literally start reproducing everything. You can see how these new towers that come into the downtown core, what that does for pedestrian traffic, what it does for congestion, what it does for cars. I can also look at soil capacity in terms of if I plant different medians if I have a different soil depth with different medians on top of that, what that does to recharge soil and to kind of disrupt the typical approach to infrastructure or just dumping stormwater into infrastructure. I can look at peak temperatures. I can look at how our built form responds to those peak temperatures and what the increased cooling capacity is. We can look at demand management. So all these things that if you actually have the tool, which now I think I agree with the comment that you made that there's tools out there now that can help inform. But I think the benefit that we're going to start seeing is if you can start actually pairing stormwater with sewage and sewage with energy and energy with amenities. I think that we've been burying all of our infrastructure for the last 100 years in Toronto or in Canada. And let's start beautifying some of these spaces by showing amenities that actually contribute to green spaces and places where kids can play. And so that's what I think that the ability now to forecast and plan and quantify is different than what we were doing 100 years ago. Maybe 100 years ago it was just considered common sense, whereas now we need to quantify things. But
yeah, so there's this opportunity to really take much of what Ron's talking about in a more rural context and do the same kind of analysis and layering and using of data in the urban context. Now, I put on my very practical hat here as a chief planner, and this all sounds to me like it takes a lot of technology and a lot of money in order to create these systems and to manage them and to be able to just generate really the starting point for the decision making. Can you kind of speak to that a little bit? Like, how realistic is it? And those Swedes, they pay way more taxes than we do. So
not any longer.
I think there's a constraint here in terms of how our municipal and provincial structures are set up and what people are really willing to pay for and the kinds of services and analysis that goes into our planning decisions.
Just to provide some context, all that work that Jay was showing yesterday was 1% of the budget. And so I think that they developed a tool. The tool allowed them to visualize different scenarios. I think there was like 6 to 10 scenarios that they then brought out to the public, and the public could vote on which scenario they liked best. And that whole work spanned, I think there was 1% of the overall budget.
Where was what was the magnitude of the area that it was done for?
It was a bridge that collapsed or a roadway that collapsed.
Right. So
it was a huge project. I think if you're planning, I think the Canadian municipal deficit for infrastructure renewal is $25 billion.
Yeah.
So I think that if you could actually think about that and say, if we're just going to replace like for like and exchange today's headache for tomorrow's headache,
yes.
There's only so many Advils and Tylenols you can pop. So if you do that, then if it's $23 billion, then is it worth the upfront cost of actually strategically planning it? And I'd probably say yes.
Well, this is our catch-22. In the city of Toronto, for example, with the Gardiner Expressway, we can repair it, and we are essentially, my kid is going to be sitting in this chair 30 years from now having the same conversation about whether we spend $500 million on it or what we do with it. We just simply postpone. It's not sustainable in the long term. I'd like to hear, because in Canada we admire the planning that takes place in Sweden and the much longer time horizon that's used. Do you use this kind of big data analysis approach to how you plan for your infrastructure?
I don't know about that actually, because I'm not daily working with that, so I'm not sure about that. But of course, we use a lot of information before we make our planning. Of course, you have to do that. I must say about this infrastructure we have infrastructure problems in Sweden too. But I think one thing that's quite different in Sweden or Europe between North America is actually that we have this city-owned monopolies when it comes to district heating, taking care of the waste, the sewage actually, not just the sewage actually, you can take the energy from the sewage. And with this city-owned monopolies that actually are financed not by tax money, but by what you say, you take it out from the household, it's by special fee. Actually work very well, but you must have long-term planning for that.
But you also must have, and we haven't talked about this at all, you must have public buy-in and support for using that kind of approach, particularly if you're going to have a household fee. How do you do that?
Yeah, we have there's a legislation that says that the cities are allowed to do this and allowed to make that kind of fees that they have to take to finance their investments in you.
Right. Now, Ron, in terms of the work that you do, how is the public engaged or involved? And I'm asking the question because we typically have a political problem when we want to initiate ideas in terms of generating understanding as to why we should be taking that longer view instead of just simply worrying about the problem we have in front of us today.
Just before I answer that, I wouldn't mind just backtracking slightly on the model. I mean, here in Toronto, we do have research from the University of Toronto. I believe you know Professor Eric Miller.
We work very closely with
his land use,
university.
Transportation, and environment model. He's going to be porting that model to Canada's fastest supercomputer, and that is for the purposes of modeling. It's a socioeconomic model, so it's like SimCity for real. Yeah. It models neighborhoods, it models people. Where do they live? Where do they work? Where do they go for entertainment? And all that transportation, all the social aspects of that. Yeah. But getting back to how getting people involved.
Could I just comment on that? Because I didn't know when I came into the City of Toronto that we in the planning department actually have a very strong relationship with Eric Miller and his team at the University of Toronto. And we do a tremendous amount of modeling and forecasting as part of our decision-making processes using that framework that Eric has created.
But getting back to social participation, and again, I don't know if we have any research projects in that area, but a lot of people are looking at gamification as an opportunity. Yeah. I mean, yeah, we all got those charts from Hydro, and to put up on our dishwasher and laundry machine. Set your timer to go at midnight so you save electricity or get a lower participation rate. I don't know how effectively that's working, but I think there's opportunities. I mean, if not everybody will set the timer and try to save themselves maybe a few cents a day. Mm-hmm. But if perhaps with social media, with social tools, if there's ways to connect to the community, say, well, so-and-so has reduced their energy consumption by 50% this month by using these tools, by installing a new thermostat, or, time shifting their dryer and things like that, or putting up a clothesline, those type of things. If you turn it into some sort of social function for the neighborhood and for the city, where people are competing to be the most energy efficient in their home, the social technologies can feed into that. Mm-hmm. And it gives that sense of community. The internet initially was about connecting with the rest of the world, but it's starting to turn around now, helping us better to connect to our communities.
Mm-hmm. Now, is that approach that's been used in Sweden?
Yes. Actually, we are, when we are refurbishing our houses, actually, we are changing all the systems for heating, cold and hot water and so on, with individual measuring, actually. And actually, it declines the consumption with between 25 and 40%. Wow. Because people see what kind of change it makes if you shower 5 minutes or 50 minutes.
Right.
And actually, that affects people a lot. When you actually, with very small investments, actually, with a small display on with the front door, when it comes into an apartment, can show how much they have consumed for the last day or last night or last week and so on.
Well, yeah, and in many ways, that's a user fee model, making it very clear what the costs are
Yeah.
instead of the costs just kind of being
Yeah.
something that everyone generally absorbs.
Yeah. And then when you transform it to carbon monoxide pollution too, I mean, then you really understand how much you can do by your own behavior, actually, to make a smaller footprint of carbon monoxide.
Well, I'm sure we have some good data from Toronto Hydro because Toronto Hydro has done this. Most of you have probably experienced it. I personally don't pay the hydro bill, so I didn't really know anything about it. And a few years ago, I was about to put the dishwasher on, and my husband went, "No, we put, it was peak period. We don't put the dishwasher on in peak period." And he taught me the dishwasher always goes on just before we go to bed because it's no longer peak period. Has a direct correlation to behavior.
Yeah.
But really, that's about costing and getting it's about costing and pricing and getting the pricing right.
I mean, you have to do the refurbishing of the apartment. You have to change pipes and everything. So I mean, it's zero cost actually to make this happen.
Right. And it's interesting to hear those numbers. So between 25 to 40%, that's a really significant impact in terms of the amount of consumption that's taking place once you put those mechanisms in place. Now, Richard, you'd mentioned at the outset about having permeable surfaces. The Kitchener-Waterloo region is pretty well known for a very innovative policy that it brought forward, whereby it in fact adjusted on a house-by-house basis the storm water fee based on the amount of permeable surface that you have on your property. So creating a direct connection to the amount of water that you're putting into the stormwater system as a result of having permeable or impermeable surfaces. I think that's another really great example, but it does take some detailed systems and detailed planning. And maybe this can take us back, Ron, just to closing off a little bit about the technology and how the technology actually links in very specifically with behavior.
Well, we've heard so much about big data. Another way to look at that is the Internet of Things. Everything's going to be instrumented. And I like the comments in terms of the feedback. Having that feedback information, other than just knowing that time shifting my dishwasher is going to save me money, unless I really track the bills very closely, it's hard to measure that. But I think it's the measurement to management, and that ties to the motivation you're talking about. Making it easier for us to see how much of a difference we're making. I didn't hear about that thing in Waterloo, but the runoff, and there's lots of simple things you can do. You can have your runoff from your roof go into your own little cistern, right, and use that for watering. It's another way for water conservation. There are a lot of simple things we can do. And I believe in gamification and community focus and encouraging communities to adopt those practices. Simple, small changes, but if we all make them, it makes a huge difference.
Richard?
Okay. I think in the last 2 days we've heard a lot about big data, and I think it obviously has a big place in the way that we shape and the way that we inform our analysis. I think the one thing that I just want to create a bit of a caveat around is that we do a lot of analysis in our shop. And there's a lot of big data, and we're working on a couple of different projects with the City of Toronto and also Brampton, Vaughan, Richmond Hill that have large data sets. And if you're not strategic in what you're asking for, and you don't know what the outcome is supposed to look like, big data can be very confusing data that actually costs more money to translate, digest, and clean than it actually is to just move it forward. So I think that the idea of big data is important, but I think the idea of streamlining what you're looking for and knowing what kind of outcome you can get with that data is important. Example with the City of Toronto, we're working with the City of Toronto to develop the energy and emission mapping for the entire city. And so you mentioned Toronto Hydro. Mm-hmm. Toronto Hydro has made all available data for electricity consumption on every parcel of land in the city. So we literally can, and there's privacy issues, so we're definitely protecting those that are consuming directly. But we can actually map electricity down to a parcel level, building level, and also neighborhood scale. But if that data is incomplete, if it's not tied back to a building type or a GFA or an area, then it's limited on what you can actually do with it. So I think it's really just about ensuring that. So I forget how many different data sets there are, but there's over 870,000 data entries for all the different buildings in the City of Toronto. We have every intersection on every road in the City of Toronto. So we're looking at the transportation emissions. We're looking at GHGs, fuel burn, all that kind of stuff. So I think that it's amazing the amount of data that you can actually get, but it's what you do with that data and how you clean it and how you analyze it. And if there's a lot of gaps to fill, then I think the quality of data just becomes questionable. So I think just being careful with big data and making sure that you ask for the right input that gets you the right output.
So we're going to move into our wrap-up, and I'd like to hear from each one of our panelists just a couple of closing thoughts on what you feel some of the most important big moves we need to make are moving forward. Before I do that, and to give you a moment to think about that, it strikes me constantly, and I see this at the city, that there is a great risk of just generating the data, which is really why I asked the question. Just generating the data is only a fraction of the exercise, because if we can't translate that data into something meaningful, or we can't figure out how to take it and parse it and communicate it in a way that it's going to affect and change behavior and inform decision making, then it's a tremendous amount of work and a tremendous amount of analysis. And I do that frequently. I get some very detailed analysis and I kind of look at it and I look at my staff and I say, well, so what? Like, I don't know what to do with this. What does this mean? What are the implications? And if we can't make that leap from all of that complexity in the data and analysis and evidence, which is very valuable, into the so what, it strikes me that we could actually kind of end up in a little bit of a vortex, because we never get to the really important part, which is impacting change and making some kind of a difference. And that's where I'd like to wrap up from your perspective. What's the big change? What needs to happen? We all watched An Inconvenient Truth. How many years ago was that now? Quite a while ago. It's fair to say that shifted our conversation about climate change. But I still feel, and I feel it with my children, who have more of a sense of urgency. I like the parallel with how we all felt about a nuclear threat. My children have a real sense of urgency around climate change that I don't feel is reflected in my professional life. And I'm concerned about that. So what are some of the big moves that need to happen if we're really going to make a big leap forward in planning more sustainable places? And maybe I'll have you go first because...
Yeah, I guess, as I said, long-term planning and then be faithful to it, actually. And then you must realize to make the society, to change to a more sustainable society, it must cost money. I think sometimes you end up in a discussion that when it comes to the budget, that we don't have the money that we need to take to bring to make a project come true, actually. And I think that's too bad, actually. You have to make realistic economic plans that to shift the society, huge societies in the Western world, is not easy and it will not be for free. And you must admit that.
Sobering.
Yeah.
Ron?
If I might challenge that, I know nothing comes for free, but the cost of technology is dropping very rapidly. The cost of computing is dropping. The cost of storing the data is dropping. We even have a research project out of McMaster. The cost of these sensors are dropping dramatically. And I was trying to find some current research. I saw a report that in 2009 in Ontario we wasted $700 million worth of water. The adoption of advanced technologies in clever ways return that investment very quickly. So there is an investment, but when we are saving, when we are creating savings, that investment pays itself back very quickly.
That's right.
So how do we find those investments? I believe, again, we need to make this a social challenge. We need to throw out challenges and say, okay, we're wasting $1 billion worth of water every year in Ontario. What are the solutions? Some of the solutions might come out of the universities. We had a water forum at OCE. There are small companies in Ontario that are North American leaders in rejuvenating municipal water pipes. Very simple research, very basic technology, but they've dramatically reduced the cost of rejuvenating these systems. I think we should have challenges that go out to say, how do we save money? How do we adopt advanced technology to save money? And although it will be an investment, it'll be an investment that pays for itself very quickly because it'll reduce money we're already spending.
So we need to shift from a paradigm of cost to investment.
Yes.
Thinking about investment as the approach. Richard?
So I have two. First one, I am a proud papa of a 2-year-old, and she's the best thing I've met. But I find that it's interesting that we keep saying that the drive to the cities, that people are going to gravitate to cities, that's where the opportunities are. yet I don't feel safe with my kid in downtown Toronto. There's a lack of parks. I think the sidewalks are too narrow. I have to have a constant, like I'm not really for having a leash on my daughter. And I don't think that's the kind of the mandate that we want to set, or the vision we want to set. But I find that for us to make the city livable and and maintain our 4th ranking status, we need to make the city more livable. And I think that needs to apply to multi-generational. It's not just my 2-year-old, but it's also the 60, 70, 80-year-old, my grandma, whoever. That's the first one. The second one, someone mentioned the other day that we're taking over prime farmland, and really I haven't heard the answer of where our food eventually comes from. And I think it's a big issue. Back in I think 1943, the Victory Garden idea that each person's backyard, front yard, whatever plot you could find satisfied, I think 40 to 50% of our growing needs as a nation. That's something that it's just completely been swept aside, and I think we only did that through urgency. And I can foresee the certain urgency coming along again, that our food systems are getting more strapped, our food quality and our food culture is getting questionable, and I think that this is really, it has a lot to do with energy and a lot to do with infrastructure, and a lot to do with congestion, but I think more to do with just quality of life and making things a little bit more simple, more connected. And I guess that's part of my story of, with my daughter, of making the streets more connected and making our landscape more connected and allowing people to actually visualize how food is grown and how you can. So those are the 2 issues that I would probably say are, and people already talked about transit yesterday, so I'm not going to discuss that any further.
Well, it's funny, when this panel was first put together and I was asked to moderate it, and I thought, well, I'd love to moderate it. It's a tiny bit ancillary to what I do every day. But I have to say that as panelists, you've all really impressed on me, and hopefully impressed on those in the room, the importance of long-term planning, the importance of livability, the importance of engagement, and those are all central to what we do in city building every day. So I want to thank you very much for your insightful comments. I have some things to go away and think about. I hope others do as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.